thank you, VicNoTill, for this conference and persevering through the COVID era and getting out the other side. It's just fantastic, and I think that I was really excited to listen to David and Jenny's presentation there before lunch, and I think that's really, to me, where the more examples like that we've got, the faster and the further we're going to shift agriculture in the direction it needs to go in. And we had our own conference about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and had 600 odd people at that, and 6 producers speaking, and they were talking about things like frog sounds and additional bird species and clean water moving off their properties. And I thought that, and it was exactly the same sort of thing as what Dave and Jenny talked about this morning. And I think that if we could spend our time in the pubs in future talking about our frogs and our birds and our water quality and our soil quality instead of our yields, agriculture is going to be in a much better place when we arrive at that point. So the reason that I got involved in carbon quite a long time ago is that consumers do not pay the full price of producing food. What pays the rest of it? The environment. Agriculture's been mining our environment for 8,000 years or more. And we sometimes in agriculture we get a bit critical of the mining industry, but I'll tell you what, they will never touch the amount of landscape that agriculture's mined over the last 8,000 years. We've got to stop that mining, and we've got to reverse it, and we've got to start rebuilding it. And the sort of stuff we're hearing about today is doing that. And so I thought that if consumers won't pay the full price of food, then maybe they'll pay for something else, and that is carbon and environmental credits. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those. But I've got a little quiz for you to start off, just in terms of a carbon project, a soil carbon project. This is a 1,600 hectare property. 2 aggregators come along and they give you a quote. And one has quoted $2,250 to do the job, and they're only going to take 5% of your carbon credits. The other aggregator is going to charge $20,000 to do the same job, and they're going to take 18% of your credits. Now, I'm not even going to embarrass you by asking you which one of those you're going to go for, because there'll be 10 or 20% of you will say, well, go for the cheap one straight up. The rest of you think it's a trick question. So you're going to hold off, but your instinct is to go for the cheap one. We'll come back to that a little bit later. So we've got soil organic matter and we've got soil organic carbon, which is roughly half soil organic matter. And when I talk carbon from now on, I'm talking soil organic carbon, not soil organic matter. And that's the humic content and the stabilised component of carbon within our soils. And when we come to trading carbon, there's 2 things. We can avoid emissions, which is things like reducing nitrogen fertiliser in particular, and reducing fuel, and reducing methane emissions from livestock. Those are the key emissions that we've got in agriculture. So we can reduce those. Reducing emissions in terms of climate change is a little bit like saying there's a cliff in front of us. What we'll do now is we'll put her in second gear and keep going towards the cliff. Whereas in agriculture, you've got the opportunity to sequester carbon. And sequestering it means you've actually pulled CO2 out of the atmosphere and you've stored it in either trees or in the soil. Now, I'm not a great believer in trying to cover the entire earth in trees. I think if we put carbon away into our soils, we will increase agricultural performance, we'll increase the resilience of agriculture, we'll increase profitability to farmers, and we'll be able to pull carbon continuously out of the atmosphere. And there is no limit to how much carbon soils can take out of the atmosphere. I'll let you stew on that one because I know there'll be a few people who disagree with me. Pardon? I agree. You agree? Thanks, Tom. All right, so the thing, if you listen to the media and you watch the TV at night, you would think that carbon is a linear thing. We pull it out of the ground and we put it through these machines here, and off it goes, and what you're looking at there is in fact water vapour, not carbon dioxide, because you can't see carbon dioxide to start with, and then it goes to the atmosphere. That's not actually what happens. I call fuels, fossil fuels and coal, etc., the long carbon cycle. That, if we go back 375 million years ago, there was 7,000 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. A combination of photosynthesis and some bugs that have the ability to consume cellulose have reduced it from 7,000 down to 230, 40, 50, 60 parts per million. And so we are releasing some of that carbon back into the atmosphere. But is it all going back to the atmosphere? Carbon sequestration is actually a fairly simple thing. We've got the carbon cycle, which is the process of birth, growth, reproduction, death, and decay. And on the right-hand side, when we're sequestering carbon, where photosynthesis is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and adding it to every living thing. On the other side of the equation, we've got oxidation, where every living thing dies and releases CO2 into the atmosphere. Sequestering carbon into the soil is simply making sure that photosynthesis exceeds oxidation. You'll never stop oxidation. You do not want to stop the carbon cycle. You actually want the carbon cycle to speed up, if anything, but you want to retain some of that carbon behind as carbon goes through that cycle. So how big's the cycle? There's 150 gigatons, which are 150 billion tonnes of carbon a year going in and out of every living thing. That's the carbon cycle. There's about 820 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. There's about 610 gigatons of carbon in all the vegetation on Earth. And there's 1,580 gigatons of carbon in all the soils, to the top metre of soils on Earth. So if you add up all the carbon in the atmosphere and all the carbon in vegetation, it still doesn't match the top metre of soils. We emit, as a society, somewhere around 11 gigatons to 12 gigatons of carbon a year. To me, it's not a very big ask, just in simple maths, to take 11 gigatons a year and put it away in a 1,580 gigaton storage, which I would guess 8,000 years ago was in fact a 3,000 to 4,000 gigaton storage. Agriculture has released more CO2 than we've released in the last 60, 70, 80 years by using fossil fuels. And we've been doing it for a very long time. But it hasn't gone to the atmosphere. So where has that extra carbon gone? Generally into the oceans, correct. So when we emit carbon, that carbon goes into the cycle. That cycle will put it into vegetation, into soils, into the ocean, and there's a bit left over that goes into the atmosphere. People have the impression that everything we emit goes straight to the atmosphere. It doesn't. And if you look at Australia, for example, there's orders of magnitude more trees in Australia today than when Captain Cook sailed up the east coast. Orders of magnitude. So our vegetation in Australia has sucked a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere over the last couple of 100 years. So let's look at how it gets into the soil. Pretty simple. We all know, basically, there's two ways it gets into the soil. One is decomposition, and it's essentially decomposition of roots. We don't get much decomposition. We get mostly oxidation from what we put on the surface. We want decomposition, and even from decomposing some of that stuff below the surface, that's also going to oxidise. But is what Christine Jones calls the liquid carbon pathway is the main pathway of getting carbon into the soil. And that is, as Graham mentioned this morning and as Guy and so on mentioned yesterday, it's that exudates from the root system. And in terms of building carbon, the root exudates are around about 5 times more important than the bulk of root material that you're going to build into the soil. So photosynthesis is the key rather than total dry matter production. This is a little bit of data from David Johnson's, and what it shows is that the green line there, and this is increasing carbon in the soil across the bottom line, the green line is total biomass production. That's above ground and below ground biomass production. And you'll see that biomass production's gone up about 7-fold as carbon increases in the soil. This little line up here is new carbon in the soil. So you'll see that new carbon in the soil doesn't match total dry matter production. So where does that additional carbon come from? It matches with an R squared of 99, or 0.99 rather, the fungal bacteria ratio, which, as we've already heard from Graham and the loam people yesterday, is it's fungi that builds soil carbon. So we've already heard that, so I won't dwell on that. So let's look at how would we go about doing and measuring carbon in the soil and doing a soil carbon project. And I want to cover 3 things. Firstly, how we go about getting it and measuring it. Secondly, some of the rules that we've got to work within and some of the methodology, a little bit about the methodology. And thirdly, economics and some data and some results over the last 6 years. So we tend to use industrial size gear because that means we can get down into any soil at any season, whether it's wet, whether it's dry. Obviously not too wet, so we get bogged, and we've done that occasionally as well. Soils come out encased in plastic, and they're sealed immediately, and then they're put straight into a cold room. And the reason for putting them into a cold room is to stop the bugs chewing up the carbon that's in that soil. So when we come to measure it, we're actually measuring the amount of carbon that we've actually sequestered. So it comes out of those tubes then and goes into this instrument here, which has a number of features to it. So if we go right down the bottom left-hand corner there, that little orange thing is a gamma densitometer. What that does is shoots a gamma ray across that soil core, and that gives us bulk density. Coming down from the top, and you can sort of see it up there, is a near-infrared spectrometer. That's a $95,000 infrared spectrometer that comes down onto that surface. And it measures a whole range of things. And so then we can measure every 1 centimetre, 2.5 centimetres, 5 centimetres, whatever space we want, all the way down the core. We can measure the carbon, the bulk density, and the moisture, which improves the accuracy of the measurement of carbon in the soil. So what we get out of that instrument is a whole lot of wiggly lines. And those wiggly lines have got to be turned into something. And that's where the maths and the real science comes in, is converting wiggly lines into things like moisture, into calcium, into pH, into carbon, etc., etc. There's a whole lot of stuff that we can learn from those wiggly lines. We also take a photograph of the soil core. So if we get an anomaly or something shoots up and says this doesn't look right, we can actually go back to the photograph and you might find a rock or a root or a crack in that soil. So we take that and start converting that into yield of carbon. And when we're talking about yield of carbon, we're talking tonnes of carbon, that's soil organic carbon, per hectare. And obviously we generally try to go down to at least 1.2 metres. We can go to 1.5 by changing some of the equipment. So if we look at a conventional way of measuring soil carbon, is to take one measurement down to 30 centimetres. So basically you get one number representing 30 centimetres, and then you get one number representing below 30 centimetres. That's relatively inaccurate when you look at the shape of the curves. So these are different strata in a soil carbon project, but you'll see that it's not a straight line in terms of carbon, and nor is it a straight line as you get down into depth. So what this technology allows us to do is actually be able to measure the carbon very accurately all the way down to the core, through the core. And in this particular instance here, the topsoil, we've measured in this particular experiment 0.75 tonne per hectare per annum increase in organic carbon. But below that, in the subsoil, we're down to 0.34 of a tonne of carbon per hectare per annum. So you add those two together and that's your carbon yield. We've just finished remeasuring about 18,000 hectares that we measured in 2016. What we're finding is that somewhere between 50 and 70% of the credits that will be issued to those properties this year will be from below 30 centimetres. And I'll explain a little bit more about why that is, and it's to do with the seasons that we've actually had. And it's a lot to do with the fact that once we get carbon down at depth, it can't get out. It doesn't oxidise. The closer we get to the surface, the more oxidation we have. The deeper we go, the less oxidation. And carbon dating information shows that carbon at about 20 centimetres can be stable for 1,000 to 2,000 years. Carbon at 1.5 to 2 metres can be stable for 10,000 to 13,000 years, showing again that the deeper we go, the more stable that carbon becomes, mainly it's because it can't get out. So how does it get down there? I think there's at least three mechanisms to get it down there. One is leaching. In our experiments, there was bugger all leaching, I can tell you that, because we went through 3 years of drought out of the 5 years. So I don't think we had a lot of leaching. But carbon can leach, as we heard yesterday as well. But I think this is all done in grassland, so in perennial grasses. So I think the grass roots are going down there. But then add mycorrhizal fungi to the grass roots, and they're going to go almost anywhere. So you've actually increased the volume, again, as Graham said this morning, you're increasing the volume of your root system with mycorrhizal fungi about tenfold. And I think it's a combination of roots and mycorrhizal fungi that's really adding to that carbon at depth. So this is a 5,500 hectare project. This was the measurements we did in 2016. The numbers there are tonnes of carbon per hectare. And you'll see the lowest area there is about 40 to 41 tonnes of carbon per hectare, and the highest is 155 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Now, if you just went out and did some transects across that property, you're going to have that kind of variability in your sampling. And therefore, you're not going to have any carbon to sell at the end of the day, because the variability will wipe out. It'll be greater than the changes that you're likely to get over a 4 or 5 year period. So this is what's called stratification, and we try and work out the soil types, the depths of those soils, all sorts of properties, generally use 6, 7, 8 covariates to work out where our carbon estimation areas are going to be and where our strata should be. So there's a fair amount of science now going into how do we actually stratify that. And the stratification reduces the variability. So if we get that right, we significantly reduce variability, which significantly increases number of credits you get to sell at the end of the day. So I'll just show you this little patch here. It's about 1,000 hectares, and we went back in there after 4 years to just look at what was actually happening. And this is what's called a heat map. So the top map there is 0 to 30 centimetres, and a red colour means we've lost a significant amount of carbon. And you can see that in that surface area, and the orange is also a significant loss. Yellow is probably about constant, and then as we get over towards the darker colours, we've actually added carbon. That red area and right through here is the best soil on that property. So losing carbon from it was quite a surprise because we expected that that soil was going to give us more carbon than the poorer soils. In fact, it was the other way around. And the reason, there's two reasons for it. The first one is that this property, along with all the other properties, had between 2.5 and 3 years of drought out of the 5 years. And out of this one here, there was 2 years of drought out of the 4 years of measurement. So the drought plus a disease that we've got travelling through Queensland, it's well down into New South Wales as well now and headed for you, called pasture dieback. Pasture dieback has no known cause and it just wipes out perennial pastures. There's about 27 species, I think, at the moment that it wipes out, including introduced and natives. And so we had pasture dieback on a lot of these properties, and on the heavier soil, the pasture dieback was the worst. So what we ended up with in here, with a big loss of carbon, was bare ground due to pasture dieback and a drought and a cracking clay. Perfect scenario to lose carbon, which is what happened. But the interesting thing is that when you look underneath that, down into here, we've sequestered carbon. So they've added more carbon below the 30 centimetres than they've lost above it. So there's a net sequestration off that property. The number that I released a couple of weeks ago was that we've done the numbers, we know how much CO2 has been sequestered off this property over 5 years. And we also know roughly, or pretty accurately, how many kilos of beef they've produced over that same period. They've sequestered 50 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of steak or mince that they've sold. Livestock have been, particularly cattle, demonised in this whole carbon debate. What this data shows is that if you want to save the planet, you better eat a lot of beef that comes off regenerative properties, right? And it's not just beef though, it's beef that's grown in a regenerative way so that we're sequestering carbon in those soils. But 50 to 1. And I've modelled some areas in this part of the world, and I think the opportunity is closer to 100 to 1 kilos of CO2 sequestered, and that's after accounting for all the methane emissions. So one of the reasons that depth has been important is that when we get things like droughts, floods, fires, it's not affecting the carbon that we've sequestered below 30 centimetres. I don't know exactly, we haven't done the numbers yet to know exactly at what point, whether it's 25 centimetres or 20 or 33 centimetres that it starts to change, but we will be able to work that out as we get more data. As most of you know, the thing that makes this work for you is that what you put into your soil is organic carbon. What you sell is carbon dioxide, which has a multiplier of 3.67. That means that for every tonne of carbon you actually put into your soil, which has its own intrinsic value in terms of productivity and profitability, but you get to sell 3.67 tonnes of CO2. And it's the only multiplier that I'm aware of in agriculture that works in your favour. So what makes it work for you in terms of profitability? So the key driver of doing a profitable carbon project is your sequestration rate. I've just put together a few numbers. So if we were, and I think I used $34 a tonne CO2 on this. So if you had a sequestration rate of 1 tonne, 1.5 tonnes or 2 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year over the 25-year period of a project, and that was on 2,000 hectares, the difference in total cash flow is 1.6 million, 2.6 million or 3.6 million. So 0.5 of a tonne of carbon per hectare per annum is basically at $30 odd a tonne, has a net back to you of $1 million. So the thing that drives your profitability is the rate at which you can store that carbon. And this, you should be in that ballpark and maybe better. but I certainly wouldn't budget you much better than that, because you are going to hit wet years, you are going to hit dry years, and you'll get years when it does a lot better and years when it does a lot worse, and that's the game you're in. Carbon doesn't just go in a straight line, it goes like this, increasing over time, but up and down on the way up. The price of carbon obviously will affect you, and we've gone from $58 a tonne not long ago back to $27 a tonne more recently, thanks to a bit of government manipulation of the market. But that'll wash out, and the prediction is for carbon prices to be back up at least around $50 a tonne by 2030. And if you decided today to do a carbon project, it won't be till 2030 till you've got much income out of it. Well, probably 2028, somewhere about there. So price of carbon will affect you. Cost of measurement is a two-edged sword, and I'll come back to that one in a minute. And then scale of project. Pretty hard to make these projects work on low scale and with low sequestration. If you had small scale and high sequestration, like 2 to 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, you can make it work on smaller scale. But it's hard to make it work on small scale. So let's come back to this one again, and let's see what the outcome was. And this is based on some real data. 1,600 hectares, $40 a tonne CO2 price. If you'd gone for, and you would have spent that 2,250 twice, because you've got to do 2 measurements, you'd have spent 40,000 here, plus lose 18% of your credits. If you went for A, you would have 0 accus, because you had 122% variance or discount on the credits due to variance. If you went with B, you've just made you've netted 147,000 after all costs, because the discount due to variance was only 52%. So as you can see, it's a two-edged sword. If you get too cheap and do not enough numbers and get the science right, your variance will wipe out. And that, if you get that variance in a baseline, you're dealing with that variance for the next 25 years. And it's going to take credits off you for the next 25 years. So really important that you get that baseline done well and accurately. And is what I call the sample cost myth. For the last 15 years, I've been hearing that sampling soils is the problem. Like, it's too expensive. What the data's now showing is it's not a sample cost problem, it's an accuracy issue. And the less accuracy you have, the more carbon credits you're going to lose over the next 25 years. And that comes right back to your baseline. So getting the accuracy up is much, much more profitable than bringing your initial cost down too much. And the reason for that is to do with this variance. If you take low sample numbers, and that's where this example was down here, basically 0 accu, because you've got this discount which is applied by the methodology, which is government determined what the discount's going to be. High variability, and you'll see that as the discount comes down, the blue line is your net income. And it gets to a point where the right number of samples will give you the right profitability by bringing your variance down to an area that you can live with for the next 25 years. So what do we sell? We sell carbon dioxide, which is 1 tonne of CO2 is 1 ACCU, Australian Carbon Credit Unit. Now, when you've got your Australian Carbon Credit Unit, it goes into an account, ANREU account, which is a special account run by the government, and every tonne of CO2 is an electronic certificate which goes into your account. Now, you can do several things with it once you've got it. You can trade it off or offset, if that's what you want to do. You can trade it or hold it. You do not need to sell it when you've created it. Or you can surrender it to become carbon neutral. And I'll come back to that one a little bit later. So what's involved in projects? Soil carbon is a really complex thing to do. The methodology is nearly 300 pages, and about 45 of those, 50 of those pages are equations. So basically you need to start off and have it planned very thoroughly. You've got to check your eligibility. My belief is that unless you're already on a regen ag journey, don't consider doing a soil carbon project. A soil carbon project needs to be an outcome from regenerative agriculture, not the reason that you do something. And then it's going to work for you because you're in it for the right reason and you'll be in it for the long haul. If you go into it because you think that here's another income stream and I'll just get carbon credits magically, that doesn't happen. They're not created magically, they're created through effort and practice change and regenerative agriculture. So unless you're prepared to make that sort of change, don't even consider a soil carbon project. You've got to register it with the Clean Energy Regulator. That's a process in itself. Takes at least pretty close to 3 months. Then we baseline two things. We baseline the carbon and your emissions over the last 5 years. That will account for your fertiliser, particularly things like lime and gypsum, particularly lime because it's calcium carbonate, and your sheep numbers, so that's looking at methane emissions. So all of those emissions are counted and they become part of your baseline, and so you have a carbon baseline and an emissions baseline. And I'll come back to the importance of that later on. Then you're ready to start your practice change. Legally, you cannot start your practice change before registration. And you can actually start it before baselining, but you're better off baselining as soon as you get it registered. So you've got to have something new up your sleeve that you're going to be doing that's regenerative, that's going to create carbon. And then you carry on the project. Basically, it's measured then about every 5 years. That will change over time. The reason it's every 5 years at the moment is that it takes a long time to add enough carbon to the soil to measure that change accurately. In some areas, you'd come back and remeasure it in 3 years. When you've got two measurements, you're likely to be able to move into modelling. In other words, we can now start to model your carbon going forward, reduce the amount of sampling, and your income then becomes annual once you move into the modelling stage. So I mentioned you need a new practice change. You've got to have the new practices, they've got to be eligible, and there's a whole list of stuff you've got to get past. And I won't go into all of that now, but you've got to have a land management strategy, and that's basically got to be done by a qualified person. That can be done by your agronomist, it can be done by RCS, and that basically is a document that must go with your registration to the regulator that says, this is what I'm going to do to be able to sequester carbon. And then we look at a thing called carbon estimation areas, and these are the areas that your income is credited to. So generally, you're not going to get credits over your whole property. You're going to have exclusion areas that are not suitable for a credit. You've also got roads and dams and housing and yards and all those sort of things that got to be excluded. But the carbon estimation area is what the credits are credited to. So if you had that carbon estimation area and that one in your same business, and this one did really well and that one didn't do so well just because of soil type or management or whatever it was, they would get issued with credits based on the performance of that CEA and that CEA. So the credits are issued on for carbon estimation area. And I've talked about registration. Things like native title come into it. You've also got to have the approval of your bank or anybody else involved in your business. They've got to give what's called interest holder consent for you to proceed and get paid for your carbon credits. This, I think, is one of the most important slides I've got. So we'll do a baseline on your soil carbon, right? So there's your baseline. will come back after 5 years and you've had an increase in soil carbon. We've done a baseline on your emissions. Now, if your emissions have exceeded your baseline, then you've got to take that level of emissions off your saleable credits. So they just disappear out of the system or retired. When you've done that, you are at net zero. There's a whole lot of stuff being talked in the industry at the moment, in the press a lot, about, oh, you don't want to go near these soil carbon projects because somewhere along the line you're going to have to be carbon neutral. And then you're going to, if you've sold your credits and you haven't got them in your back pocket and you're going to have to buy them back again, that is utter and complete bullshit, right? That's a technical term for not being correct. And the reason is that every company in Australia, every country in the world is heading towards net zero. Now, net zero means you're not carbon neutral because you have a level of emissions in your business. Australia's going to end up with a big level of emissions even when we reach net zero. We're still emitting, right? You're still emitting, but you will be at net zero. Whatever product you've produced will automatically be net zero if you're doing a soil carbon project. Now, if you want to be carbon neutral, you can then take a chunk of those credits there and retire them. But if those credits are worth $50 to $100 each, there is no business in the world that's going to pay you the value of that for the product to be carbon neutral. It's pure economics, that you're better off being net zero and sell your credits so that it is additional income. And if you're net zero, you're the same as everyone else. So I, quite frankly, don't get this bit about carbon neutral. Why would anyone expect farmers to be carbon neutral and no other company in Australia or the world to be carbon neutral, right? So get that terminology right and understand the difference between the two. And if you hear anyone talking to you about going carbon neutral, well, you could probably work out how much they'll have to pay you for the privilege. And it'll be a lot more than what they're prepared to pay you in terms of premiums on products. So let me show you a few results. So all our results to date come out of the grazing industry, because when we started in 2016, the methodology only allowed us to do things in the grazing industry. So that's a continuously grazed property on the left and a cell grazed property on the right. And when you look into the pasture, there's obviously a lot more of it, but when you look at the soils, you can start to see the change in colour. And this property on the right is sequestering 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, compared to the one on the left over a fairly extended period. And if you're sequestering 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, you're well and truly in the money in terms of carbon projects. That's highly profitable. Most of you here would have heard or be well aware of Gabe Brown, and these are some of Gabe's results. So when he started out, he had 1% organic carbon in his soils. Now that's probably only to about 10 or 15 centimetres. And then with no-till, bit of crop diversity, bit of cover cropping, he went very, very slowly. And his sequestration rate through this period was about 4.8 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum. Now, several things happened at this point here. He introduced livestock, he introduced multi-species cover cropping, but he also hit 2% organic carbon. And so the curve shifted. So I couldn't tell you the contribution of those 3 things to that curve. But he's gone from 4 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum to 24 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum. So and a lot of people will say, well, why don't we just go out and try and suck every bit of carbon out of the country that we can, and then we're going to get paid more over time. You won't. You probably get paid less, because where you'll be is on this bit here. The lower your carbon now, the longer you're going to be down here before you get to 2% organic carbon, and then you start to accelerate. The system at that point can start to grow upon itself. So a few results. This is from West Australia in coarse sand. We've got a few West Australian guys here. You would actually know a little bit about coarse sand. This is at Mora. You would know that too. So 0 to 30 centimetres, 6 years, lower rainfall than average, and this was based on putting subtropical perennial grasses into that sand versus an annual grass right beside it. And it sequestered between 5 and 10 tonnes of CO2 per hectare per annum, which is 1.3 tonnes of C per hectare per annum, which surprised me in that basically pure coarse sand. But I want to share with you these guys here, these 5 guys that started out with us in 2016. The CEA areas, there's 4,000, 2,500, 3,000, etc. hectares. So the carbon estimation areas averaged 76% of the property areas. The total property areas were a bit over 18,000 hectares. These are their average annual rainfalls. This is what they actually got over that 5-year period. They're down to, across 5 years, about 82% of rainfall. But in the worst years, they were down to 40% of annual rainfall. And there was 2 years like that. Most of you might even remember 2018 and 2019, although many of you will have probably tried to forget them. So they've been through drought, they've been through pasture dieback. This guy on the bottom was totally burnt out in the New South Wales bushfires in 2019. The top guy had 2 floods as well. So everything that you could throw at these over the last 5 years they've experienced. And this is their income from carbon. So one of those guys has not sequestered carbon, and which is actually to do with the calculations rather than whether he's sequestered carbon. His percent carbon has gone up, but when you do the calculations, he hasn't actually sequestered anything. So under the 2018 method, he'd sequestered 80,000 tonnes of CO2. When we converted that to the 2021 method, he'd gone nowhere. So it's all in the calculations, and we've got to get to the bottom of that. But you can see the net income. This is before tax. 216, 143, 124, 109, average of $117 per hectare per annum. And that compares to an average annual income from livestock, EBIT from livestock, of $23 over the same period. Now, your net incomes are going to be substantially higher than that, but that indicates to you how tough some of those years were, is the very, very low income. So I thought, well, let's look at the last year, the 2021 financial year, where the highest cattle prices on record, and of course they'd come up a fair bit, and comparing that to average across our benchmarking group. So they're better than average, except this guy who's basically still in drought, and that, which is only $46 a hectare, is the net income in the best livestock price year on record. So not making a lot of money out of cattle. So what that's indicating is that it can provide a reasonable additional income even in adverse circumstances. And we're further north than you, which means we're likely to be oxidising more carbon than you will as you come further south and it cools down. But I have a lot of concern about this focus just on CO2. While ever we treat this one tiny little gas that's 0.04% of the atmosphere out there as an enemy, we're going to get unintended consequences. And we're already seeing a lot of those, I believe. So I think we've got to be very careful. Not that we shouldn't be doing something about carbon and climate change, but to think that that's the only thing we should be doing is absolutely dangerous. And so one of the things that we've been doing is experimenting with natural capital, and how do we actually get that valued, and how do we monetise it. And so for the same properties, this is the estimated natural capital value per hectare per annum. You can see that generally that exceeds carbon. And the two are additive because the soil carbon is not included, the change in soil carbon is not included in the natural capital numbers. So I think where we're headed is we're going to get to a position where we've got soil carbon and natural capital that are two things we can add together. Also, we'll be bringing, by 2024, you'll be able to also include your reduced emissions in your carbon accounting and get paid for that. At the moment, you don't. Oops. So what is natural capital? Basically, it's our stocks of natural stuff, our geology, our air, our water, all living things. So what we've been able to do with that natural capital is to say, right, well, firstly, how do we measure it? So we work that out. Secondly, once you've measured it, how do you value it? Thirdly, once it's valued, how do you convert a value into a financial instrument that you can then sell? That's the point we're at. We've actually got through to that financial instrument, and we're running a pilot project at the moment that's got 25 properties in it, Australia-wide, all sorts of scales, right down to 25 hectares, right up to 100,000 hectares, in all sorts of environments. There's cropping guys, grazing people, there's all sorts of stuff in it. And that's given us a valuation of just under $1 billion on 25 properties of the change in natural capital value on those properties. Now, the beauty of natural capital compared to carbon is we can go back. The reason that valuation is so high, that all those people were clients of ours for 20 odd years, and so we've got some of them, we've got between 15 and 25 years worth of information and change in natural capital. And you start ramping that up over time, and that to me means that if we go back, if we get the natural capital valued and funded like that, then that's going to fund you into carbon projects going forward, plus the natural capital can roll forward based on that as well. It's a lot easier to do. It's not regulated. The government has not had any finger in any part of that pie, I'm pleased to announce. But we're at the point now where we've got $300 million worth of that natural capital in the market right now, and the last phase of this is to see whether they'll buy it. And unless we can sell it in that kind of volume, we don't actually have a market. We don't have anything that's going to work. So it's a watch this space. It's still an experiment. Hoping like hell we can get to sell it. So it'll be a really exciting space. If you can't do a carbon project, you can at least do a natural capital project, but a little bit away yet. So finally, we work in an ecosystem, and I look at our ecosystem like a pie. We've got carbon at the centre of that ecosystem. We've got ecosystem services, and then we've got key things around our water cycle energy flow, which is how well we utilise sunlight energy, biodiversity and soil health. And for the last 8,000 years, we've been shrinking the size of that pie. And it makes sense to me that with a change of management and a change of the way we want to do things, we can start increasing the size of that pie. So I think I don't know whether we're finished or whether we've got time for questions there, Tom. A couple of quick questions. Don't want to run on too long. No. No questions? Righto.
Leave it for the Q&A.
Yeah. No, I won't be here for the Q&A, so. Yeah.
Is there a computer system that spits out records where the samples have to be taken?
Yep.
And how many more samples do you take?
If I told you that, I'd have to kill you. Because it's actually cost us several $1 million to work that out, and over a lot of years. So we use some really smart algorithms, firstly, that have taken, again, years to develop to look at the stratification process and the getting the CEAs designed. And then there's a computer program that actually determines, and you have to, the day you do that, you have to submit to the regulator what seed number you use to calculate your random numbers to get the random positions of soil cores. And we'll over-allocate those soil cores. We're getting to a stage now where what we want to be able to do is, while we're in the field, is to be able to track the variance in the sampling so that we can pull up when we've taken enough, or keep going if we haven't taken enough. And so that's where things like the Hone instrument out there is of real interest, because we might be able to use that. And we can't use it to actually measure carbon because we can't calibrate it properly, but we can use it to measure variation. And so we're headed in that direction, which will we'll keep those numbers absolutely accurate as we go forward. But it does vary, depending a bit on the variability of the country, obviously, and on scale. So Will had a question.
Where do you see that exponential growth nearly in organic carbon once we get over 2%? Is that 2% organic carbon over the full metre price, or is that just...
No, that's just in the surface. It's generally 0 to 15. If you're seeing it there, it means you're going to be able to drive it down. And I think that's what happens, is once you get that there, because all of that stuff up here is part of the carbon cycle. Like, you're oxidising a lot of that carbon in that space, but the further we can push that down, the less oxidation we've got, the more sequestration, and that's why the depth has become really, really important.
Do you want to just touch on why you're talking about that depth, about why infinitely sequestering carbon is possible?
Yeah, why can we infinitely sequester carbon? I forgot to point out on Gabe Brown's, and his is probably a good example, right? I'll use that example. So he started with 1% organic carbon. He's now 7% organic carbon all the way to 1.5 metres, and he now has 465 tonnes of organic carbon in the top 1.5 metres of his soil. Now, that soil has reached saturation, which means he's not going to get any more carbon into that soil to 1.5 metres. It can probably continue to go down, but when it reaches as far down as it can go, what will happen then?
Yes, buy a new block of land. Start again.
What will happen is his fences will start to get shorter, right? Because all that will happen is you'll build soil. That's why, even when your soil reaches saturation, as a percentage, you can continue to add carbon to that soil forever because you'll just grow soil. How bad would that be? If you grew soil with whatever your saturation point is, and a lot of you will be lower than 7%, but if your saturation point was 4% and you reach 4% all the way down as far as you could get it, and then you built soil at 4%, what a brilliant system that would be.
Why aren't the subsoil, like if the carbon can't even get out of the subsoil, why aren't the subsoil saturated?
That's a really good question, and I don't know. Potentially, we haven't got systems to drive the amount of carbon down into that subsoil. And I think potentially when that subsoil was laid down, there might not have been the vegetation there to create the carbon in it. So, but it's a really good question, and I don't know a good answer to it.
What are the geographical constraints with building carbon that you've seen in different soil types?
Really good question. What are the geographical constraints? Up until fairly recently, we would have said you want to probably be above about 500 millimetres. So the ideal is high rainfall, so anything above 600, and the higher you go, the better, until you get too much. Cold temperatures, and a soil with clay content. You don't want too much clay. So the more of those three things you've got, the more carbon you can hold. And as you drop temperature out, or you go higher in temperature, or less clay, etc., your sequestration rate tends to come back. But overriding all of those things is management. By far and away, the most important thing is management. I can have all that. I can have a beautiful soil, high rainfall, cold temperature there on that property, and not sequester any carbon at all. And that property's got a different management, and they'll sequester a lot of carbon. Management is the key. It's what you do that'll sequester carbon. Yeah, I think forget about getting a premium on your food, although there is a premium out there now for regeneratively grown beef over and above organic. But what will happen down the track, and by 2030, if you're not regenerative, you're going to have a significant discount or not be able to sell your product. And that's being driven by the markets, and it's being driven by the money. The banks are going to start driving that. So you need to be on the regenerative journey. And it's not that there's a destination, it's actually be on the journey. And there's 3 banks I'm aware of right now that the first questions they're asking in a bank review or an application for funding is, what are you doing for your environment? What are you doing about ESG? And that is going to get stronger and stronger as we move forward. Mick? That was, from memory, probably about 6. It could be depth, yeah. And I got to add that those results at the moment are unaudited. We're going through the audit process at the moment, so though I can give you really definite answers on a lot of this once we've gone through audit. So it's pre-audit, but it's, pretty solidly measured. So but those are the numbers we came up with. So the difference there is that it's a relatively low carrying capacity. So he's running, say, beef to 3 hectares, but sequestering 6 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. You can see very quickly that there's a massive sequestration rate relative to the number of animals that he's running. Methane's taken off, and in my book I removed 1.5 tonnes of methane per animal, and which is excessive. Like, there's no way in the world those animals are emitting 1.5 tonnes of methane, but that's what I removed.
During that drought period, were those guys destocked, running with cattle?
One of them was totally destocked, and that's the guy that got burnt out. That's in New South Wales, so he had no carrying capacity left, but he destocked and kept ground cover, which is why he then got burnt out. But all the rest, they destocked, like they reduced. Some of them were back to probably 20% of normal carrying capacity, so they adjusted stocking rate to carrying capacity. Only one of them was fully destocked.
One more question, yeah.
You've done a lot of work, Terry, with the livestock industry in particular. Have you had any projects running in parallel with the cropping, the grains industry?
Yeah, really good question, and we haven't, because up until fairly recently, we couldn't actually do cropping projects under the methods. And the 2018 method allowed us to do cropping, but it had errors in it. And so we didn't do any projects under the 2018 method, so we had to wait the 2021 method, which now means we can move forward. But I'd love to be doing some projects under regenerative cropping. And the numbers that Guy was talking about yesterday, and I think, you're well and truly in the money on those. If you're doing 5 or 6 tonnes of CO2 in one season, you're well and truly in the money. I think there's real possibilities.
Even with, if you weren't, say, cover cropping in between growing those cash crops,
No, the thing that sucks the CO2, the carbon out of the soil, is a bare fallow or a dry fallow or a chemical fallow. That's where you do the damage. So you whack it in the crop and you lose it when you've got nothing growing. So try and grow something. Living stuff like David was talking about. Extend that growing, the amount of living root you got there.